Good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua O'Driscoll, and I'm an assistant curator of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts here at the Morgan Library. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming you to what promises to be a fascinating lecture on the topic of illuminated Hebrew manuscripts produced in Central Europe during the later Middle Ages. A talk presented by two leading experts in the field, Adam Cohen, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, and Sharon Liberman Mintz, Curator of Jewish Art at the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York. Before introducing our speakers in more detail, I'd like to mention that this lecture is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Imperial Splendor, the Art of the Book in the Holy Roman Empire, 800 to 1500, which is on view here at the Morgan until January 23rd. This is an exhibition that I co-curated together with my colleague Jeffrey Hamburger, the Kuno Franke Professor of German Art and Culture at Harvard University. Gathering together some 70 illuminated manuscripts and related works of art from across the country, this exhibition is the first major presentation of this subject in the English-speaking world. Beginning with the reforms initiated by Charlemagne, the first medieval emperor in Western Europe, and ending with the flurry of innovation that coincided with the invention of the printing press and the onset of humanism in the 15th century, the exhibition introduces visitors to core aspects of this history, including how artists advanced a visual rhetoric of power, the role of the aristocratic elite in the production and patronage of manuscripts, and the impact of Albrecht Dürer and humanism on the arts of the book. A virtual version of this exhibition is available on the Morgan's website, where it will remain in perpetuity, and includes images of all the objects, all of the wall and label texts, the audio guide, installation shots, and links to related programming, which will eventually include a recording of tonight's talk. So please do check the museum's website for that content, as well as for information on other programs, concerts, and upcoming exhibitions. This exhibition and its related programming was made possible through the generous support of many donors and sponsors, including the Janine Luke and Melvin R. Seaton Fund for Exhibitions and Publications, the Ricciardi Family Exhibition Fund, the Christian Humann Foundation, Catherine J. Rayner, the David L. Klein Jr. Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Fund for Research and Publications, Caroline Scharfman Bacon, Elizabeth A. R. and Ralph S. Brown, Mr. and Mrs. Elaine Goldrach, Marguerite Steed Hoffman and Tom Lentz, Professor James H. Merrow and Dr. Emily Rose, Mrs. Andrew C. Schurmeister, the Samuel Kress Foundation, Gifford Combs, Sally Vaughn, William Volkley, Gregory Clark, Bob McCarthy, and an anonymous donor. Tonight's presentation also serves as the keynote lecture for an international conference taking place over the next few days at Princeton University. One of the main goals of this conference, which is titled Power, Patronage, and Production, Book Arts from Central Europe in American Collections, is to expand on the purview of the Morgan exhibition. The 13 papers encompass material written in Czech, German, Hebrew, and Latin, made for both religious and non-religious contexts from the 9th to the 15th centuries. These talks can be attended remotely via Zoom. Registration for the conference is free and available at the website bookarts.princeton.edu. I'm very grateful to acknowledge that this conference is generously co-sponsored by the Index of Medieval Art at Princeton, the Department of Art and Archaeology, also at Princeton, the Center for Culture, Society, and Religion, the Program in Medieval Studies, the German Department, Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, the Humanities Council, the Delaware Valley Medieval Association, and the Morgan Library and Museum. Now back to this evening's speakers. Dr. Adam S. Cohen is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto. He received his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University and is a specialist in the history of illuminated manuscripts from the European Middle Ages. He has written and edited numerous books and articles on both Christian and Hebrew subjects. Most recently, a book aimed at the general public entitled Signs and Wonders, 100 Haggadah manuscripts, or 100 Haggadah masterpieces, published in 2018, which is a history of the illustrated Haggadah from the High Middle Ages to the present. And together with Jill Caskey and Linda Safran, Professor Cohen has written what promises to be an important new textbook on the history of medieval art from a global perspective, entitled Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World, forthcoming later this year from Cornell University Press. As the Curator of Jewish Art at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, Sharon Liberman Mintz specializes in the fields of Hebrew illuminated manuscripts and rare printed books. Over the course of 35 years at the JTS Library, Mintz has curated more than 45 exhibitions and co-authored 11 exhibition catalogs. Since 1995, she's also served as the senior consultant for Judaica and Hebraica at Sotheby's, cataloging and appraising Hebrew books for Judaica auctions worldwide. She most recently co-authored and edited the volume I Am the Scribe, Joel ben Simeon, published in 2020, which focuses on one of the most famous figures in late medieval Hebrew manuscript production, the scribe and artist Joel ben Simeon, who was active in Germany and Italy in the late 15th century. This evening's lecture, which is based on important examples drawn from American collections, will consider the production, use, decoration, and meaning of Hebrew illuminated books made in Central Europe between the 13th and 16th centuries. This material is of fundamental importance and ought to be much better known than it currently is. And perhaps even more urgent, it ought to be much better incorporated into the prevailing historical narratives of the Middle Ages. I have no doubt that this lecture by our two eminently qualified guest speakers will be an important contribution toward this goal. Both speakers have generously agreed to take questions after their talk. This Q&A session will not be recorded. So please please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage.
Thank you, Josh, for that very generous introduction. Before I turn to my formal comments, let me make two off-page remarks, only one of which is suitable for the camera. First, I'm so personally grateful to be here. I realized in preparing to come that this is probably the first time in 2 years that I had to decide what to wear. And, you know, I hope I got it right. At the very least, I wore the, classic book tie that I think I bought here at the Morgan many decades ago. And it's so nice to be back in this building, to be with people and to be with the manuscripts that were assembled in this spectacular show. I know it's been years in the making, and to see it come to fruition, to see how beautifully it's been executed, it's so moving on both a professional and personal level. Also, I should say, more suitably, that although I will speak for more of the time tonight before handing the podium over to Sharon, that this paper was a complete work of, we were complete partners from beginning to end, and I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea that her contribution is somehow lesser. On the contrary. Okay. So it is truly an honor to be able to speak here at the Morgan Library and Museum, especially in conjunction with Imperial Splendor, the art of the book in the Holy Roman Empire, 800 to 1500. As those who have already visited know, this important exhibition showcases, in the words of the director, Colin Bailey, quote, the many important yet understudied illuminated manuscripts from Central Europe held in American collections. And as the accompanying publication by Professor Jeffrey Hamburger of Harvard University and Dr. O'Driscoll of the Morgan itself amply reveals, these manuscripts are indeed full of splendor and tell a rich story about Central European books, artists, and society over the course of 900 years. In our talk today, we hope to add one more layer to the story by looking at the same time and place through a different lens. Stimulated by the example of Imperial Splendor, we have scoured institutions across North America and have identified approximately 25 decorated Hebrew manuscripts that were made in the territory corresponding to the Holy Roman Empire and that are contemporaneous with books in the Morgan exhibition. The majority of these are unfamiliar even to specialists of the Hebrew book. There is one notable scholarly exception, and in crafting this lecture, we have relied on her pioneering work spanning the last several decades. It is therefore with great professional and personal gratitude that we recognize the important contributions made by Dr. Evelyn Cohen and humbly dedicate this talk to her. North American collections hold thousands of medieval Hebrew manuscripts, most without any decoration at all. Among those that are decorated, many come from territories throughout Europe where medieval Jews lived, including Iberia, Italy, and France. These tell a vital part of the story of the medieval Hebrew book, but they fall outside the boundaries set by Imperial Splendor. So, as painful as it is, we must tonight set aside such gems as the splendid mid-15th century Bible, Uptown in the New York Hispanic Society, or another likely made in Avignon right here in the Morgan Library. Rather, our focus will be on only the 25 manuscripts made in Central Europe between the 13th and 16th century. This date range is relatively late compared to the examples in Imperial Splendor because, as far as the historical record shows, there simply were no decorated Hebrew books in Europe before the 13th century. That absence is a topic worth exploring in itself, but it would not make for a very visually appealing lecture. Still, we should recognize the point before moving to what we do have. As different maps demonstrate, the same area can be conceptualized in different ways. Such places as Mainz, Nuremberg, Constance, Regensburg, and Prague were key cities in what we call the Holy Roman Empire, if we consider matters mostly from a political point of view. The map included in the back of the Imperial Splendor publication is color-coded to indicate the overlap of political boundaries for the electorates and a Christian topography. Note, for example, the Archbishopric of Mainz in pink. And also, while we have the map on the screen, take note of the cluster of dots here in Franconia, where the first decorated Hebrew manuscripts in Europe were produced. To be sure, medieval Jewish residents of Mainz or Regensburg were keenly aware of these political and ecclesiastical constructs, but from their religious perspective, they primarily viewed themselves as part of an entity they called Ashkenaz. This was, in brief, the overarching Central European community of Jews who followed certain religious practices and intellectual traditions that were sufficiently distinct from the practices of Jewish communities in Islamicate lands, the Eastern Caliphate, the Mediterranean, and Iberian Sfarad. Italy, we might note in passing, served as a kind of crossroads between these two worlds, but it had its own particular rite reaching back well into the early Middle Ages. It is also worth remembering that, like the Holy Roman Empire itself, Ashkenaz was a large geographic and temporal entity and was not monolithic. The experience, practices, and perspectives of Jews in, say, Mainz in the 12th century were not the same as those in Regensburg at the same time, or those of, say, Prague later in the 15th century. The Ashkenazi manuscripts made in the territories corresponding to the Holy Roman Empire in certain ways respond to and amplify the story told by Imperial Splendor. But at the same time, Ashkenaz was not the same ideological construct, and the experience of the Jews in those lands was shared with, but not the same as, the Christians who made and used the books in the exhibition. In the span of 45 minutes, it is impossible to do justice to the rich story of Hebrew manuscript decoration in Central Europe. Nor can we communicate the many interesting particularities of each and every one of the 25 medieval Ashkenazi books we have assembled. But we hope that our general overview will be informative as it outlines the particular history of the Hebrew book, even as it provides another lens with which to consider the Christian manuscripts in the Morgan exhibition. Before plunging into the books in detail, two further preliminary remarks help give a roadmap for what follows. First, we should briefly address and dispense with the notion that Jews in the Middle Ages were constrained by the second commandment against graven images from having decorated books. The matter was put to one of the greatest medieval legal commentators, Rabbi Meir ben, or Ben meaning son of, Baruch, also known as the Maharam, who lived from approximately 1215 to 1293. Born in Worms, Trained in part in Würzburg, he was most commonly associated with Rothenburg ob der Tauber, the Franconian town where he lived for several decades, including when it became an imperial free city in 1724. In response to a legal question about the permissibility of illustrations in Hebrew prayer books, Rabbi Meir ruled, based on a consideration of earlier Talmudic texts, that it was not a violation of the second commandment to decorate Hebrew books with two-dimensional imagery, even with human figures. The concern, rather, was with worshiping images. It is clear that Rabbi Meir himself was not an advocate of doing this, but neither did he prohibit a practice that was recently and innovatively developing there in Franconia. Second, it is useful to quickly outline the range of Hebrew books that in the Middle Ages received visual decoration. The following brief survey is not restricted to manuscripts from Ashkenaz, but is meant simply to tantalize you with what is out there. These books include, of course, the Bible, though not the Torah scroll that was used during liturgical services and was never decorated. Prayer books, known as Moxorim, contained the cycle of prayers for the entire year. The synagogue's prayer leader would chant from these monumental manuscripts while the community listened, joined in song, and could at times observe and contemplate the decorated pages. In the private arena, smaller personal books of prayer would occasionally be decorated, but of the manuscripts created for private household use, the Passover Haggadah received the most extensive illustration. Finally, though fewer in number, there are other genres of medieval Hebrew manuscripts, such as legal compendia, medical works, and philosophical texts that were also adorned with illustrations. It seems appropriate to begin our consideration of Hebrew Ashkenazi manuscripts with the Moxor, because it was one of the most richly illustrated Hebrew books in medieval Central Europe. Our entry into the topic is, suitably, this gateway image at the beginning of the Moxor and the Colophon at the end. And as an aside, stimulated by the labels, we should note that a Moxor usually comprises two large volumes. The first half of this exemplar is now in the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the second is in Amsterdam's Bibliotheca Rosenthaliana, probably separated in the 19th century. In many ways, the Colophon is typical of what we find in medieval Hebrew manuscripts, both in terms of what it tells us and what it does not. It gives us the name of the scribe, Colonymus, the son of Judah, the place it was written, Esslingen, and the date it was completed, equivalent to January 12th, 1290, exactly 732 years ago yesterday. This date allows us, and place allows us to sketch a precise historical context for the manuscript. Esslingen on the Neckar River, while not the largest Swabian city in the Middle Ages, had been an imperial free city since 1181. By 1290, its prosperity and Christian topography were evident in several newly constructed churches, all outfitted with extensive stained glass in the latest style. It was a center of learning. One literary figure was the anonymous schoolmaster of Esslingen, whose works were included in the Codex Manessa. And another was our scribe, Colonymus ben Yehuda, a member of Esslingen's relatively sizable Jewish community. Its synagogue, just a 5-minute walk from St. Dionys, the city's main church, is attested already in 1268, while its cemetery was used for many of the smaller Jewish communities scattered throughout the region. Colonymus identified himself as a scribe, but he was most likely responsible for the visual elaboration of this page. It contains the opening words of the first liturgical poem, called a piyut in Hebrew, for the morning service of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. The first 3 words of the text, "King girded in strength," are enlarged to proclaim the central theme of the day, God's kingship. The impact is enhanced visually by the architectural frame, which marks the special entry physically into the book and spiritually into the prayer. In communicating the magnificence of God's kingship, Colonymus adopted the architectonic frame, a device common first in Christian books and then Jewish ones. It was also used, for example, in contemporary stained glass, such as in these panels from the St. Dionysius Church. Two perennial questions emerge from this comparison. To what extent did minority Jewish artists borrow from the majority culture around them, and to what extent did they manipulate the imagery in purposeful ways? Or to put the matter in more concrete terms, when Colonymus decorated his Moxor page in this manner, was he consciously subverting Christian claims about the church as a physical and religious construct? Or did he think of a Gothic-styled building as a neutral signifier that could unproblematically refer to the kingship of the Hebrew God? It is not hard to see the lions, which both support and surmount the columns, as signals of God's kingship, an iconographic sign shared equally by medieval Jews and Christians. But what about the eagles? They were, of course, an imperial symbol, as seen, for example, in this depiction of Henry VI in the Codex Manessa. Presumably, this was another sign of God's kingship. But was Colonymus showing his support for the empire and declaring the Jewish community's loyalty to it? Or was he vitiating the idea of a mortal Christian ruler in comparison to the Jews' supreme, eternal King of Kings? It is not possible to answer this question in a vacuum by considering just a single page, so we need to expand our field. We can start with another Moxor, so closely related in script and liturgical content that it has also been presumed to have been made in Esslingen in the 1290s. It is called the Double Moxor because its two volumes are also located in two different collections, Dresden and Wrocław. One quick comparison makes clear, we hope, the scribal and ornamental similarities. And like the Esslingen Moxor, some pages in the Double Moxor have architectural frameworks, like this one for a Yom Kippur prayer. On the Day of Atonement, a key theme is the gates of repentance and mercy. Here, the word gates is enlarged and embellished and made visually explicit by the golden panels swinging open on either side. The page is iconographically rich. At the top is an empty throne, which represents God the King. Even if two-dimensional imagery was permitted, depicting God in human form was absolutely forbidden. This was a clear contrast to Christian visual practice, as is abundantly evident in the Imperial Splendor exhibition. The medieval art historians in the audience will have already noticed the four symbols: the ox, the lion, the eagle, and the angelic man. Picture in your mind's eye, if you will, the Ezekiel's vision of the heavenly chariot refracted through the book of Revelation, where the symbols were commonly used to symbolize in Christian art the four evangelists, as seen in the Berthold Sacramentary's crucifixion image, or the coronation of the Virgin in the Heinrichus Missal, also upstairs, four evangelists. In the Double Moxor, the symbols have been appropriated, or perhaps we might say reappropriated, to communicate a theophanic version of heaven during the intense moment of prayer seeking God's mercy. In a deeply charged case like the four beasts, it is hard to imagine that the Jewish patrons and viewers would have been unaware of the Christian valence that they were surely rejecting. In a similar vein, a common inversion of Christian iconography in Ashkenazi manuscripts was the hunt motif, an example of which can be found in the top margin of the Wettingen gradual leaf. A finely executed Ashkenazi example is in this Rhineland Moxor on the screen, held in the New York Public Library. Among its 500-plus folios, the only fully painted page is for the powerful evening Kol Nidre service. At the top are two battling hybrids. There they are. And many Ashkenazi manuscripts contain images of knights in combat, and here it presumably underscores the theme of life, death, and divine judgment that is so central to Yom Kippur. The upside-down eagle in the ascender of the letter Lamed perhaps subtly suggests an inversion of secular might. The hunt on the bottom of the page shows a twofold inversion. First, here is the weary stag, but its hunter is an ugly creature riding a goat, and the pursuing dog seemed to have been deliberately effaced by the overpainting. Similarly, the head of the supposedly wily fox is hidden in the hole that he has entered on the left. Meanwhile, the rabbit he hunts is escaping from another hole, stage right. Hunts like this in the New York Moxor and several other Hebrew manuscripts are a visual leitmotif that crystallized a strand of Jewish self-perception as prey in an increasingly violent Gentile world. But not every iconographic motif need be theologically or politically freighted. Another Moxor in the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, also made in Franconia around 1300, is typical in the way it uses medallions of the zodiac symbols and labors of the months to evoke the calendrical seasons. A version of this iconographic tradition can be found in a 13th century Psalter from Würzburg in the Getty Museum, and already adopted in the Worms Moxor, also made in Würzburg in the 1270s. In these Moxors, the medallions illustrate the Passover prayer for rain, which overtly refers to the zodiac symbols. The particular form of the symbols and labors is surely indebted to Christian art, but there seems little reason to think that their use in the Moxors was meant in any polemical way. It was, rather, a useful, neutral way to indicate the passing of the seasons. Another prayer book created in Franconia, also in the last quarter of the 13th century, makes explicit visual reference to specifically Jewish ritual. In the Luzzatto Moxor, there are 4 individual illustrations of a man blowing the shofar, the ram's horn, emphasizing the importance of this act during the Rosh Hashanah prayers. The representations were not necessary for the performance of the act, but they highlighted these special moments in the service. They also served as a practical visual mnemonic, signaling to the cantor that the ritual was about to be performed. There are subtle differences in the 4 Luzzatto images that deserve attention, but we highlight here only a single shared detail. In each case, the shofar blower raises one foot on a chair or low stool. The pictures predate by over 100 years the first textual reference to this custom and remind us that illuminated Hebrew books can be vital if rare records of medieval religious practice. The actual reason behind the practice is not clear. Was it practical, so that the blasts of the shofar would carry further and be heard by all in the synagogue? Or perhaps it was mystical, to prevent the earthly demonic forces from interfering with the ritual. Could it have been both? As art historians, we are not prepared to settle this matter, but we can offer another insight based on a consideration of artistic production. Most of the decorated pages can be attributed to the scribe, Abraham. He does not name himself in a colophon, but as was the custom for Jewish scribes, he drew attention to his name by highlighting its appearance in the text. At times, Abraham elaborated his letters with decorative penwork, and in opening word panels, he worked with a limited color palette and negative space to create his designs. The Shoshan panel shows the process underway. His figural abilities are, admittedly, somewhat limited, but certainly lively and effective. Here, a Jew raises his hands, looks up, and responds, Amen, to the prayer above. What is notable is that there is a single page, folio 42, where the panels are gilded and the flesh of the figures is built up with paint. It is precisely this page that contains the blessing for the blowing of the shofar, the central ritual for Rosh Hashanah, whose biblical name is actually Yom Teruah, the day of blasts. We surmise that a professional and likely non-Jewish artist was engaged to give increased magnificence to this key page in the Moxor. The identity and religious affiliation of the artists is often the first question raised when discussing the subject of medieval Hebrew illuminated books. We have deliberately postponed addressing it in the hope of communicating how much there is to say otherwise. In this matter, of course, there is a range of possibilities. There are books where there is no reason to imagine anyone other than the Jewish scribe executing the decoration. There are books of some artistic accomplishment that were also likely done by the Jewish scribe, such as the Esslingen Moxor. If we compare Colonymus's rendering of the architecture to the other Moxor written in Esslingen, that is also on the screen, we see that the latter artist has a firmer, more assured line, uses a richer color palette, and is more adept at creating volumetric figures. Because we cannot yet really explain the mechanics of how Jews, who in this time and place were not admitted into professional workshops, would have developed the technical skills to produce such works, the default presumption is that the artist was a Christian. This was undoubtedly the case in the earliest dated Hebrew decorated manuscript in Europe, a Bible commentary manuscript written in part by a certain Solomon ben Samuel from the city of Würzburg and dated to 1232-1233. Robert Zuccale demonstrated that it was painted by a Christian artist, perhaps a certain Heinricus Pictor in Würzburg, while Eva Freumovich has considered the role of the Jewish concepteur who turned to the professional for this ambitious new Hebrew illuminated project. But we should not exclude the possibility that over the following decades, there were Jews who were not only familiar with the practices, style, and iconographies of Christian illuminated books, but were also able to execute such paintings. As Karl Georg Pfantner has recently reminded us, it is important to avoid sweeping generalizations, but rather try to decide on a case-by-case basis for each manuscript. What was more important than the religion of the artist, of course, was the religion of the book's patron and user. We have discussed something of the liturgical function of the Moxorim, but they had a social dimension as well. As numerous colophons make clear, these books for communal use were made for specific individuals, presumably prosperous men whose status in the community was enhanced by their support in the creation of the expensive books. We can probably extrapolate from this example about other Moxorim. We can probably extrapolate about other Moxorim from a blessing inscribed in the Worms Moxor of 1272, which praises the person, presumably the patron, who brings it to the synagogue. This also happens to be the earliest example of written Yiddish and speaks to the social matrix in which these books existed. The later engraving by Albrecht Altdorfer of the synagogue in Regensburg shortly before it was destroyed in 1519 helps us to visualize the transfer of the large liturgical book from the private home of the sponsor to the public theater of the synagogue on the holiday. I hope you can make out that he's carrying the book. During the performance of the liturgy itself, monumental Moxorim such as the Esslingen Moxor would be primarily for the eyes of the cantor himself, who was the representative of the community before God. But in the small space of medieval Jewish synagogues, we can presume that the entire prayer community would be aware that he was using a splendid book and have opportunities to view it. And they would certainly know who is responsible for making such a book possible. In the Ashkenazi manuscripts, there are no self-reflexive donor images of the sort seen in the Imperial Splendor exhibition, though the colophons serve a similar function. And unlike their Christian counterparts, these Hebrew service books were not the product and possession of either monasteries, churches, or individuals, but straddled the line between the private and the communal. The Moxorim we have been considering were usually the product of a team, and we know from some colophons that a book of 300 to 400 folios would have taken about a year to complete. The main text would be written by a principal scribe, a sofer in Hebrew, like Hieronymus of Esslingen. Once the text was written, a vocalizer, the nakdan, added the vowel points under the Hebrew letters so that the reader would know the exact pronunciation. In the Esslingen Moxor, the nakdan added his own small colophon, which is outlined and blown up. You can see the relative size of the colophons. It says, "And I, Joseph, the vocalizer, punctuated it also at the same time and place. It is pleasing to read in it, and also itself pleasant." Unquote. The Worms Moxor from Würzburg shows a figure grasping the word scribes and holding a book inscribed with 3 names: Judah, the scribe of Nuremberg; Simcha, the scribe; Shemaiah, the French. Identifying Shemaiah in this way shows that Ashkenazi Jews were aware of distinctions of this sort. Finally, in Bibles, to which we now turn our attention, yet another team member would be the Masran, the scribe who adds the Masoretic text, as we are about to explore. As noted earlier, the sacred Torah scroll was never decorated, but there was a tradition of copying and decorating biblical codices for study and paraliturgical use. Since at least the 10th century in the Islamic Middle East, Jewish scribes had copied the Bible together with short philological and textual comments called Masorah. This is the Hebrew word for tradition, and the comments, written in miniature script, were meant to transmit to subsequent generations precise information about the exact form of the biblical text. The main Masorah, often called the Masorah Magna, included quotations of biblical verses where a particular linguistic form occurred, and it was traditionally written on a few lines in the upper and lower margins of a codex page. A representative Ashkenazi example is this opening to the book of Job in a monumental Hebrew Bible produced in Franconia circa 1325. Here is the Masorah Magna. Don't worry, by the time you all leave here, you'll all be experts in deciphering Masorah. Already in the early period, talented scribes would shape the text of the Masorah into various geometric shapes and designs, often quite complex. In Ashkenaz, the more abstract decorations of previous centuries gave way to full-fledged illustrations of birds, animals, real and mythical, grotesques, and even human beings. In the page here, this is evident in the initial word panel, which has been turned into a foliated menagerie of Masoretic notes that seems to be yet another hunt scene. We take delight in forms like this, but not all medieval rabbinic authorities did. One, Judah the Pious, writing around 1200, wrote that, quote, "One who hires a scribe to write the Masorah for the Bible should make a condition that he should not make the Masorah into drawings of birds or beasts or a tree or into any other illustration, for how will he be able to see and read it?" This injunction was written well before any surviving examples, and obviously not everyone followed this stricture. As in the case of marginalia in medieval Christian manuscripts, these inventive micrographic forms offer, I should take the opportunity to show you more examples. They offer a range of potential interpretations. Sometimes a leaf is just a leaf, and a dragon is just a dragon, whether it's micrographic or these lovely examples from the Esslingen Moxor. But sometimes, with patience and persistence, the complexity behind these forms can be discerned, as in a Franconian Bible of 1304. Look at the bottom. Here's the blow-up detail. And what I'm about to show you in 3 slides is the essence of a very complicated argument by Sarah Offenberg, who has revealed the rationale behind these swordsmen, whose shape was motivated both by the content of the Masoretic notes themselves and the relationship to the central Jeremiah text on the page. And you're going to have to let your eyes do the work here, because if I used words, it would take all night to unpack this. But I hope that these slides communicate something of the complexity and the logic behind the Masorah and its shape. Offenberg has suggested that the non-aristocratic thug should be seen in the shadow of the Rindfleisch massacres of 1298, an interpretation that unfortunately has much to recommend it. As we have seen, the first bloom of decorated manuscripts in the Holy Roman Empire occurred in the first third of the 13th century. This was the result, in part, of a significant increase in German-speaking Jewish communities after the expulsion of the Jews from French royal lands under Philip Augustus in 1182. And the Moxorim demonstrate the prosperity and acculturation of Jews in German-speaking Ashkenaz. But in 1298, the Rindfleisch mobs murdered thousands of Jews throughout southern Germany and completely wiped out dozens of communities. Jews moved, but sporadic massacres continued. In 1338, for example, the Jews in Deggendorf, Bavaria, were burned alive. The proximate cause was probably a combination of debt, poor harvests, and a retaliation for a fire in the town. By the time the incident was recorded in the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, the cause had coalesced into righteous indignation and punishment for the Jews' desecration of the host. And then, in the wake of the bubonic plague, dozens of Jewish communities were intentionally wiped out, including Mainz and Cologne in 1349. As painful as it is, we should pause to remember that depictions of Jews as the enemies of the Christian God, as in this Psalter initial, were not simply an iconographic formula, but contributed to a culture with implications for life and death. Needless to say, there were also implications for the circumstances around the creation and survival of decorated books. In the Luzzatto Moxor, for example, the Piyutim indicate a provenance in southern Germany and a date in the late 13th century, but the vocalizer appears to have come from France. A hand from the second half of the 14th century has written in the margin of the Yom Kippur service, quote, "Here in Konstanz, we say the piyut Adon Ketikach Moed." Additional annotations reveal that the Luzzatto Moxor was later in northern Italy. It was not always the case, but too often the peregrination of scribes and manuscripts was the result of persecution and forced upheaval. Don't worry, we are not going to end on that note, but rather I'm going to step aside and Sharon will take us to the end.
Thank you, Hannah. There are Ashkenazi Bibles, other than the Paris sword fighter examples, with imagery that can be interpreted in light of these historical events, but none are in American collections. Nor would we want to suggest that this was the predominant theme in decorated Bibles. A Bible dated 1313, and now in the Princeton University's Scheide collection, has 336 folios, but only a few decorated pages that were likely executed by the scribe Solomon ben Neriah. Here we see in the opening page of Genesis, it has a decorative Masorah at the bottom, over here, right? So blow up. And the words Bereshit in the beginning are illustrated, well, they're actually decorated, in enlarged colored letters and inhabited with creatures. These strike us as decorative rather than iconographically significant references to the creation. Surprisingly, The openings for the books of Exodus and Numbers, also in this manuscript, are more artistically ambitious, embellished with the kinds of monumental architectonic frames we encountered in the Moxorim. This is the, oops, sorry, no, go back, the opening to the book of Shmot, and over here to Numbers. So, the most richly decorated Hebrew Bible in American collections that was definitively made in the Holy Roman Empire is also the latest dated of the group that we're discussing tonight. It is a 3-volume Bible written in 1489 in Prague. And as was often the case, the initial of each biblical book is enlarged. But the fine application of gilding, the rich hues of the background colors, and the delicacy of the foliate panels is exceptional among Ashkenazi manuscripts. Further foliate decoration extends from the panels and in several cases fills the margin in a style that is comparable to the German and Bohemian illumination of the second half of the 15th century. And several examples of this beautiful style are currently on display in the exhibition galleries upstairs. The artist of the Prague Bible has yet to be identified. A contemporaneous book, probably made in Ulm around 1470, shows a similar artistic richness and allows us, finally, to consider the Passover Haggadah, one of the most profusely illustrated genres in medieval Ashkenaz. Like the Prague Bible, this book has numerous exquisitely decorated initial word panels. The first folio seen here features one of the many representations of ritual activity. In this case, the search for prohibitive leaven in the cabinets before Passover. And you can see he's checking to make sure that no breadcrumbs are left before the holiday of Passover. As compelling as they are, we will have to ask you to ignore the borders, which were probably added to this manuscript in the 17th century. And we also have to apologize for not treating the genre of the Haggadah at more length. At this hour, I can best recommend a good book on the subject, which actually Josh already noted, Signs and Wonders, by my colleague and good friend, Adam Cohen. Still, let us make 2 points about the Cincinnati Haggadah. This Haggadah contains the text for all Haggadot contain the text for the Passover Seder, the annual home ritual that reenacts and recounts the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Among the texts is an analysis of the 4 kinds of sons: the wise son, the wicked son, the simple one, and one who does not know even how to ask a question about the Exodus. Here you see the wise son, and he is not portrayed as a youth, but rather as a mature, learned man. His intellectual status is evident from the books, and his material status from his ermine-trimmed robe and impressive chair. This is, of course, a familiar motif, not only from Christian manuscripts, but also from Hebrew ones, and such as this author page that you see in a mid-15th century copy of the Mashal HaKadmoni, a book, it's called Fables of the Ancient Ones. It's a treatise with moralizing tales written by the Castilian Jewish scholar Isaac ibn Sahula in 1281. The value placed on literacy and learning is evident in both examples. The second point to make about the Cincinnati Haggadah is a social one. Inserted in the very last page of are 2 ownership notes. One, in the medallion over here, is that of Taublein, the daughter of Issachar, and her Yiddish name means little dove, and it is given visual form. Above that, in a smaller inscription, we find that Leah, the daughter of Moses, gave the book to her son-in-law as a wedding present. This Haggadah was originally made for a male patron, as the name in the Colophon notes. However, it was passed down through the generations by female owners, and we have every reason to think that this is not an exceptional case. Arguably, the best-known illuminated medieval manuscript from Ashkenaz in American collections is the Washington Haggadah that is now in the Library of Congress. This was the subject of a 2011 monograph by David Stern and Katrin Cogman Appel. According to its colophon, is written in 1478 by, quote, the humblest of scribes, Joel ben Simeon. Calling himself a humble scribe is a common literary trope, but Joel need not have been humble. He was the most prolific Hebrew Jewish scribe and artist we know. There are 12 signed manuscripts by Joel and another 20 where we can detect his writing and art. These manuscripts, with the bits of information he includes in the colophons, allow us to trace in some detail his life and activities between the 1440s and 1490. Joel ben Simeon is exceptional in identifying himself as an artist. This is recorded in the Colophon of the Haggadah in the Jewish Theological Seminary library, which makes explicit reference to his triple skills as a scribe. And he says here that he is both the scribe, the artist, and the vocalizer, the nakdan. Joel also records his Ashkenazi roots and tells us where Cologne is, presumably because he was writing this manuscript in Italy. Like other medieval Jewish scribes and artists, Joel ben Simeon was not part of a professional workshop, and he likely moved around based on changing political fortunes and where work could be found. He can be attested to early in such German cities as Ulm, but worked later primarily in northern Italy. Although he moved back and forth over the decades, serving Jewish patrons, whether they were under the political control of the Holy Roman Empire or the Duke of Milan. Manuscripts on the move and issues of patronage bring us to the final section of this talk, a consideration of the historical circumstances that brought treasured decorated Hebrew manuscripts from their place of creation, Ashkenaz, within the Holy Roman Empire, to the important libraries, both public and private, of the United States of America. Let us take a minute to look at the larger historical context. During the first half of the 19th century, American Jews were few in number. In 1820, there are said to be about 3,000 Jews in all of America. And the general circumstances in the first half of the 19th century did not encourage the creation of collections of rare Hebrew books. Furthermore, even if there was a desire to collect, Hebrew books were not easy to come by, and for all intents and purposes, at this time, there were no book dealers who dealt in Hebrew books and manuscripts. This changed in the last decades of the 19th century with the growth of the Jewish population, where in 1880 they numbered 250,000 people, and with the founding of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1875 and the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1886. And you see images of both these institutions on the screen. Both these institutions were established to educate rabbis for the Reform and Conservative movements and to promote the scientific study of Judaism, also known as Wissenschaft des Judentums. But of course, it is impossible to scientifically study the core texts of Judaism without books. And understanding that books and early manuscripts would be of primary importance to accomplishing their mission, the leadership of these institutions determined that the acquisition of deep and broad collections was central to their goal. In the first decade of the 20th century, the presidents of both these institutions, Salomon Schechter at the Jewish Theological Seminary and Kaufman Kohler at Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, appointed scholarly and highly capable librarians who were equal to the task. Alexander Marx, seen at left, the brilliant scholar and librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary for half a century, acquired private libraries of Jewish books en bloc and began to transfer treasures of European collections to the seminary. The indefatigable efforts of Marx bore fruit, and the JTS library grew from 5,000 books and 3 manuscripts when he began in 1903 to 43,000 volumes and 1,700 manuscripts in just a decade. So there's an enormous growth. Marx was supported by the major Jewish philanthropists of the day, Jacob Schiff, his son Mortimer Schiff, Felix Warburg, Louis Rabinowitz, to name a few, and perhaps most important, Judge Meir Sulzberger, the first American Jewish collector of Hebraica on a large scale. And Meir Sulzberger actually donated his collection to the JTS library. These individuals understood the vital necessity of a great library for the development of Jewish scholarship in America. At the same time, these donors also made significant contributions to such institutions as Yale University and the Library of Congress to demonstrate their civic American virtues. Parallel with the growth of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, we find the Library of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati was also flourishing. The librarian there, at this same period, Dr. Adolf Ocko, was born in Kharkov, Russia, and like Marx, received his education in Germany. Ocko came to the United States in 1902, and in 1906 was appointed librarian of Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, remaining in that position until 1933. Under his leadership, the Hebrew Union College Library grew exponentially, and he would often travel to Europe to buy collections en bloc. So shortly after World War I, he visited Europe and purchased 18,000 volumes, including the Edward Birnbaum music collection, as well as many manuscripts and printed books. These two immensely important libraries were, and still are, the most significant repositories of Hebrew manuscripts in America. But the Library of Congress and the New York Public Library, seen here on the screen, were also central to the story of decorated Hebrew manuscripts in American collections in the early 20th century. The New York Public Library was organized in 1895 by the consolidation of the Astor and Lenox libraries. Just 2 years later, the Division of Jewish Literature was inaugurated. Its nucleus consisted of the books formerly scattered throughout the numerous departments of the library, but the collection soon grew, and the funds for acquisition were furnished by the very generous Jacob Schiff, a banker, businessman, and philanthropist, not unlike J. Pierpont Morgan himself. Within a decade, the Division of Semitic and Oriental Literature within the Library of Congress was established in 1913, and also the result of the gifts of Jacob Schiff. And they received 15,000 volumes of Hebraic and Judaica due to his generosity and donations. The Schiff donations consisted of two collections brought together by Ephraim Dinard, a Russian-born book dealer and one of the greatest Hebrew bookmen of all time. He was a bookseller, bibliographer, publicist, polemicist, historian, author, editor, and publisher, all rolled into one. Dinard was a colorful character, to say the least. He traveled throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, gathering books and manuscripts, and sold his finds to the leading libraries in Europe. After he arrived in America in 1888, he continued his role as a middleman, sourcing rare Hebrew books and manuscripts from around the globe. Dinard sold whole collections, large and small, rather than individual books, and built several institutional libraries, including, from his final collection, the Harvard College Library. Manuscripts from that collection do not figure into this lecture because, as important as it does not have medieval illustrated Hebrew manuscripts. But it's just an aside. One of Dinard's collections that was sold to the Library of Congress included Joel Ben Simeon's Washington Haggadah, which we spoke of earlier. The late 19th and early 20th century was a watershed moment, as anyone familiar with the history of the Morgan Library knows. The economy in Europe was contracting, old aristocratic families were putting their collections on the market, and new collectors like J. Pierpont Morgan were asserting themselves, bringing magnificent manuscripts to America. In addition, the death of several private European collectors of Hebraica and the rise of institutions like the Hebrew Union College and the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the support of American Jewish philanthropists similarly brought whole collections and individual precious books here. And you can see some of the places where Hebrew manuscripts are, decorated Hebrew manuscripts are in America. Representative of this trend are three decorated medieval manuscripts from the Noun collection of the Italian scholar Samuel David Luzzatto. These are now in the New York Public Library, in the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and a private collection in Ohio. It is worth noting, however, that for the most part, these Jewish philanthropists were not collecting for themselves, but rather providing financial support for the books to go directly from Europe to American institutions. In a sense, then, they were like the patrons of the medieval Moxorim we discussed earlier, acting for the community even as they enhanced their own status as benefactors. Let us take a closer look at one such patron, Louis Mayer Bennowitz, a United States manufacturer and philanthropist. Bennowitz, who was born in Rusan, Lithuania, emigrated to the United States in 1901 at the age of 14. And in a classic rags to riches tale, he came penniless and worked his way up. In 1916, he established a very successful corset manufacturing company in New York. He's known as the Corset King, and had the wherewithal to begin collecting. His collection included antiquities, medieval art, French and Renaissance paintings, and works by, among others, Titian, Cranach, El Greco, and Rubens. 33 paintings from his collection were given to the Yale University Art Gallery. Bennowitz donated books and several important illuminated Hebrew manuscripts to multiple collections. It is thanks to his support that the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary could purchase the Esslingen Moxor, which you see here top right. The New York Public Library acquired both the Ashkenazi David Bar Pesach Moxor, which we talked about earlier, as well as an equally important Moxor from Italy, right over here. The Library of Congress received significant collection of autographs and photos, and to Yale University Library, Bennowitz presented the celebrated manuscript collection of the Yiddish writer Shalom Asch. In our own time, we are witnessing an interesting phenomena where important decorated Hebrew medieval manuscripts are being sought after by leading museums and private collectors. The Mainz Moxor, once owned by the fabled Moses Montefiore, was acquired in 2018 by the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. I should note that such manuscripts rarely come to market, and of course, not all the manuscripts in American collections are from Ashkenaz, so I'd just like to point out two others here on our hometown territory. In the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a 14th century Iberian Bible, purchased in 2017, and a mid-15th century Mishnah Torah, a legal compendium acquired jointly with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Israel Museum in 2013. One of the most exciting acquisitions of a decorated Hebrew manuscript in America was that of the Getty Museum's purchase of a richly decorated Bible known as the Rothschild Pentateuch. That it is magnificent is without doubt. That it is also a fact that it is from Ashkenaz. But where exactly in Ashkenaz? Some scholars who have begun to study this Bible make a claim for its origin in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Suggestions have pointed to Cologne, while others are more inclined to think that it has come from France. And this is why we actually have not spent time on it in our talk, because debating that question is going to wait for another conference sometime this spring at the Getty. In the meantime, we hope that the manuscripts we have discussed tonight demonstrate the richly subject of medieval Hebrew book decoration and how much it might add to the broader conversations around medieval European manuscript illumination in general. Thank you very much.